Hello, everyone out in bloggingheads.tv land. My name is Daniel Bessner, and I'm the Pyle Associate Professor in American Foreign Policy in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And I'm here to do a Blogging Heads with Eli Lake. Eli, why don't you introduce yourself, even though I'm sure everyone watching/listening already knows who you are.
Yes, I'm Eli Lake, and I'm a columnist for Bloomberg at the Yoko Ono School of Foreign Policy. Kidding about the last part, but I was teasing you because of the Scoop Jackson affiliation.
Right. We might get into the ironies of my being at the Henry M. Jackson International Studies and who that is a bit later. But what inspired this Blogging Heads was that the whole Leffer Stephens, the whole Bret Stephens, bedbug instance. And just to remind everyone, and Eli, chime in if you think I'm mischaracterizing anything, but essentially sometime, was it a week and a half ago at this point, about last Tuesday, we're recording this on a Saturday, but about 9 or 10 days ago, a Twitter storm erupted when a professor, I believe he was from George Washington, right, Dave Karp, who KARPF, who is a professor of political communication or strategic political communication, I forget the exact title, posted a tweet after it was revealed that the New York Times newsroom had bedbugs, saying something along the lines of, and I think this is critical, and then we can talk to it, Bret Stephens is a metaphorical bedbug, or the bedbug is Bret Stephens, or something along those lines, basically the joke being that Bret Stephens was a quote-unquote metaphorical bedbug. The tweet famously got 9 likes and 0 retweets, so it was not like a viral storm. But later that day, I believe, or later that night, Karp received an email from Bret Stephens, the columnist at the New York Times, the op-ed columnist, basically inviting him over to call him a bedbug to his face and have dinner with him, and they could have a conversation. But the problem, at least as Karp saw it, and unsurprisingly I would agree with him, is that Stephens CC'd GW's provost, therefore giving an implicit threat to trying to get him fired or something along those lines, or at least at the very least disciplined in some way. Karp responded by tweeting the email, and there was an entire another firestorm on Twitter. One of the many Twitter firestorms erupted, which eventually culminated in Stephens leaving Twitter and Karp going on a small media tour, making a number of points that I think I want to highlight, which is something along the lines of that Stephens wasn't engaging in real debate. What he was trying to do was use his authority, cultural authority from writing on the New York Times op-ed page to silence Karp's speech, which is ironic because Stephens, and Eli, correct me if you think I'm wrong, has basically made a bit of a career about defending, the right to speech on campus, particularly the right to conservative speech on campus, particularly organized, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, around quote-unquote a pro-Zionist or pro-Israel speech. So it was ironic that someone who had made his career doing this was trying to silence an academic, which one might argue is a paradigmatic example of a totalitarian or authoritarian politics. I don't like the word totalitarian. We can get into why. So this ignited a Twitter storm, and then Stephens responded, I believe, on Thursday with an op-ed in the Times that didn't specifically reference the Twitter exchange or Stephens leaving Twitter, but essentially, I think, made the analogy that the type of speech that was engaged in by Karp with the referring to Stephens as a metaphorical bedbug echoed in uncomfortable ways. Stephens argued the rhetoric of anti-Semites in the 40s, the Nazis, of course, in particular, even though Stephens included a quote from a quote-unquote Polish anti-Semite, which is not a particularly accurate representation of the quote that he cited, referring to Jews as effectively bedbugs during the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in, I believe, 1943. So this ignited yet another Twitter firestorm, and I had a tweet go semi-viral, which I believe said something along the lines of, quote, "Well, he did it." Bret Stephens compared his being called a bedbug on Twitter to the genocide of 6 million Jews, end quote. And then Eli, you retweeted that tweet and said he didn't. And then that's what inspired me to have this debate. So sorry about that long précis, but that, I think, is how it happened. And Eli, please tell me where you think.
Well, I would object at first to saying that there was any danger of the silencing of this George Washington University professor. I mean, I should say, full disclosure, I'm friends with Bret Stephens, so so take that for what it's worth. But I would argue that this professor and the professor has nothing to fear from center-right columnists of the New York Times, and that the conflation of this with the issue of free speech on campus is a little is a lot of a stretch in my view, because there's I see the point that CCing the provost would appear to be sort of trying to sort of what was the analogy on Twitter, like, let me talk to your manager or something like that. But I actually don't know if this guy has tenure, but like
he does.
And what
he does.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? So I mean, I think the issue is that from Bret's perspective, and I feel weird speaking for him because he can certainly defend himself. He went on MSNBC, but I think that what he's saying is, listen, this is not some random troll. It's somebody who was a university professor in George Washington University. In a larger sense, you could argue that this is, these are people who are sort of participants in the Republic of Letters, and that even if I'm not going to speak for Bret. I'll say I don't think that the professor is a sort of bringing back Nazism. What I do think is the issue is that it's very casual that he then he's making a Twitter joke and hardly sort of saying like, oh my God, he'll never be able to dunk on Bret Stephens again is not really a threat to his academic freedom, and which is not, he's not threatened, by the way, to do. He was rewarded in many ways because he publicized all of this. And the bigger point, though, is that I just think that in an era when we have become very sensitive to the wider issue, which Bret talked about in his column, which is the use of eliminationist rhetoric for categories of people, and this issue of civility, I'm saying in this broader sense, that I just think that there's a separate agenda here, which is that there's a lot of progressives who are, baffled and angry that Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss are writing for the New York Times in their editorial page, and they sort of feel that it's and that this became, I think, really part of that agenda, and that it's really, in that respect, as I kind of tweeted in my exchange with Adam Serwer and a couple other people, I just think it shows that, because Bret is an appropriate target, that it's okay to amplify this charge, that's calling him an insect. That is not, in my view, like Bret compare. I mean, I don't want to even get into that because I kind of abhor. This is about how writers treat each other on social media, and I think that Bret was really raising a separate issue in his column, which is about, if you look at it, he made reference to some of the right-wing nationalists in Europe and things like that today. But there is something here where I just felt like everybody piling on was really just about sort of pursuing their longer agenda of, trying to get Bret off of the New York Times op-ed page.
Well, of course. I mean, that's politics. I mean,
yeah.
It's shocking. I won't disagree with that, obviously. But the question that to me is interesting, I have two questions for you. First of all, why CC the provost? And then second of all, do you not admit that there have been recent instances of left-wing professors, and Karf, I don't even know if he's particularly left-wing, but people like Steve.
He is, I think. But,
yeah, unsurprisingly, he's a professor. He's left-wing like me. Professors are left-wing. I think that it's not accurate to say that these things never have blowback, particularly when you look at the Stephen Salida case or the George Ciccarello-Marr case, and they've said things that I don't necessarily agree with. But I do think that there have been recent instances of left-wing professors being highlighted by people in powerful positions and essentially having their academic freedom, if not legally denied, effectively circumscribed. So to me, Well, is that not important? I mean, as a professor, I could tell you that there are repeated right-wing attacks on campus and FOIA requests on campus to see what quote-unquote liberal and left.
I would argue that there's I disagree with pro-Israel groups on campus trying to deplatform or prevent pro-BDS speakers from speaking. Like, I know that happens. I think that's bad. But I think there's far more instances of where speakers on campus, there's either excessive security or what we saw in the famous Middlebury case where, there were literally it was like a physical riot. And, they had to scurry this, what's his name?
Charles Murray, right?
Well, yeah, Charles Murray off of campus. And it's I just think that in terms of social pressure on campus, university professors have far more to fear from outrage from the left than they do from Bret Stephens or really the right. And usually there's a kind of rallying around the flag approach. I have to go back and re-remind myself of Stephen Saleta. I seem to remember that he did say some pretty atrocious things. I don't know about the other case that you mentioned. And there are times when you have to ask yourself, is this a question of squelching one's academic freedom, or is it a question of not everybody gets tenure? I don't know. You would know academic politics. My partner is a professor right now too, so I have some window into it, but that's not really my world. But I would say that, let's be real. University administrators are far more worried about blowback, I think, from the left than they are from elements.
Why do you think that is?
What?
Why do you think
they are themselves? That's their community.
They're worried about donors because the university system, particularly the public university system, has been so hollowed out that they're worried about donors. So I don't think that we should claim that the system they're afraid of the left for articulating a critique of free speech. Which
I think in general, I just think I'm just saying if this incident had been about, if there had been a professor who had called Michelle Goldberg or I don't know, Roxanne Gay, or I said Jane Mayer or Bedbug, I just think that there would be a very different response from other blue checkmark people on Twitter. I just think I think people would be talking about eliminationist rhetoric and how bad it is. And my point is that, what?
Context matters. Bret Stephens is an incredibly privileged, wealthy white male. Context matters. It's different when you call Michelle Goldberg something or Roxanne Gay something.
Hold on. Michelle Goldberg, I know her very barely, but she lives a pretty good life. She's, I don't know. What are you talking about? She writes for the New York Times.
Something called patriarchy, right? Do you?
I'm not denying that there's a patriarchy, but I'm saying that you're talking about two major league columnists for the New York Times who I don't know how much I don't know how much either of them make, but I'm just saying it's they're in a position of influence and they're published in the New York Times.
No, of course not. But what I'm saying is there's clearly a different context between one white Jewish male professor calling a white Jewish male New York op-ed columnist a metaphorical bedbug. I mean, he didn't say he's vermin, he's lice. It's not der Everge Juda or der Stürmer, right? And to deny the context in which it actually occurred is, I think...
Really, if that's your quibble. I mean, listen, I accept that the guy is not a Nazi. I'm not trying to make that argument. And I don't think Bret was trying to make that argument.
Well, I mean, again, there's a context. When you publish an article 2 days after you leave Twitter because you were called a metaphorical bedbug, in which you literally say the incivility of our discourse echoes one of the worst atrocities in human history, and you specifically use a quote that references bedbugs, I think he's making the implicit analogy. I mean, I'm an intellectual historian. No, Bret Stephens didn't say him calling me a bedbug.
Yeah, but then if you read the next paragraph in that column, he then goes to cite examples of leaders referring to minorities in their country as bedbugs or migrants or things like that. Now, I agree with you that he probably put the bedbug example in his column as a tweak at the George Washington University professor and everybody who did all that, and that's fine, but I don't think that you can say that he's comparing himself to the fate of the Warsaw Resistance. I don't think he was doing that. And I think if you take this column as a whole, he makes a really good point. And I would add one more thing. I think that Bret Stephens should be commended for being one of the few people in the Trump era who is just as unrelenting on the left as he is on Trump, and that almost like every other column, he... And I can't think of very few. I can't think of really anyone else. I mean, a lot of people who used to be more on the right, like a Max Boot. They have pretty much become full resistance. And then there are people who, have sort of accepted Trump in the space. I mean, in my own way, I think my column has been critical of Trump and at times critical of the left. But I think Bret is the best at that. And for that, he should be commended. But instead, what happened, because Twitter is such a toxic place, is that both the right and the left just completely dunked on him. So that kind of ratio, for lack of a better word, just led me, not just out of friendship with him, but just to sort of just take a step back and sort of say, you know what, I just think that for all this talk of we have to watch the rhetoric and everything like that, it changes. And I think the argument that, he's a Jewish privileged white man or whatever, I don't think that that's really relevant. I think actually Bret Stephens is a much harder person to defend in certain online communities right now than Michelle Goldberg. That's not denying the patriarchy point. It's just saying that in your world of the kind of, academic center left or whatever you want to say, defending Bret Stephens is a tougher position to be in than, defending Michelle Goldberg.
Yeah, because I think he has a history of making disgusting comments and writing disgusting columns about.
All right, well, I wouldn't call him disgusting, but okay, fine. But my point is that Bret Stephens has done the one thing that everybody says, oh my God, I wish principled conservatives would do more of, and this is what he gets.
Well, I just have to say the people who are critiquing, but I think what you're calling the left, you mean liberals and conservatives, are what I would call the real left, the political left in the United States, who does critique both. But let's leave that aside for now. Why do you think he CC'd the provost? What do you think he was trying to do?
Well, listen, again, I don't want to get into his head. What I think he was saying in that interview, I'm just relaying what he himself said, is that he feels that, if you're a professor and you're representing these institutions, it's important. But listen, I sort of think that that's the one area where maybe he shouldn't have CC'd the provost. I think if he would have just sent it to the professor and say, hey, why don't you come and, listen, this is effed up that you said this, and why don't you come to my house and I invite you to say it to my face or something like that. I think that that's fine. And I also think that I think the difference is that he's not a troll, he's a professor. And I think that he's sort of taking that seriously as a sort of representative of an institution.
So I have a question, because I think it emerges from your point you just made. So you said Twitter is toxic, and I think no one would disagree with that, right? But I think you also have to appreciate, or not you specifically, but one also has to appreciate the democratizing potential of it. So when William Safire was writing for the New York Times op-ed, who did he interact with, right? A series of other elites who basically shared his background, both racial and class and gender, and also his worldview. So I'm just wondering if you think, because to me, the whole Stephens leaving Twitter or David Brooks getting dunked on or what may have you, what you may have, is that these people in their spheres, and these are spheres that I grew up in. I went to Columbia, I went to Duke, I'm now a professor. I know people like this. They're not used to getting questioned or getting the hierarchies from which they have benefited from their entire lives questioned. So to me, it's also there's an uncomfortableness with actually getting quote unquote dunked on, because it demonstrates that you don't actually have the consensus position that you think you had. And I think there's a lot of things that demonstrated, of course, most importantly, Trump's election. But I think, quote unquote, getting piled on Twitter is another example of that. So what do you think about the democratizing potential of Twitter?
Yeah, I don't really see it. I mean, I just, first of all, the argument that like a conservative in the media, like Bret Stephens or myself, is not used to having their worldview challenged is rich.
Well, I think that right. I mean, there's definitely
William Safire had to have his worldview challenged every day he went to work at the New York Times.
Like, to a certain degree, not about fundamental questions of capitalism, not about fundamental questions of patriarchy and white privilege that he probably didn't recognize as such. So I do agree in some things there's challenge. Your worldviews are challenged. But if you're on the center right, you're definitely not outside of polite society or even the Overton window until maybe very, very recently with people under 40. So I think that's a bit not accurate as someone who very much is in these spaces. I don't think that's a fair representation. I think certain assumptions are allowed to go unquestioned until very, very recently.
Well, if you want to say that you interact with a wider variety of people on Twitter, that's fine. But like most of Twitter interactions are so surface and brief and sort of by necessity sometimes, but often too often sort of done in kind of bad. I don't want to say by necessity, but done in kind of a bad faith way. They're done in a way to sort of gesture and posture for your own audience. I don't think that there's any kind of dialogue about that. And I also question your assumption that Sapphire or others were unaware that there were lots of socialists around when they were writing that didn't agree with some of their fundamental assumptions. The kind of conservatism that I like is one that is built out of a kind of reaction to the excesses of socialism in the left. So I would argue that at least among the neoconservatives, that there is a very much of a familiarity with that. I mean, that is where Norman Bedard's and Irving Kristol and that whole generation came from, Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. So they're later
than Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. Alcove 1 and Alcove 2 is in the 30s. They're a little later generation, the people you're referring to. They're 50s.
Well, wasn't Kristol, no?
A little bit, a little young.
Okay, all right. I thought Kristol was certainly in that area. But anyway, my point is that everybody, that there was at least a kind of that came to terms with that. So, I don't know. I mean, are you arguing that, like, and also what is the intellectual substance of, like, the new very online socialists other than that they, like, do you think, like, are you saying, like, Chapo Trap House is, like, adding an important element to our dialogue? Because, I mean, like, what do they do?
Chapo Trap House does one. It's like a gateway drug. It's obviously not. I mean, there is some sophisticated political analysis, but it's not supposed to be like a professor's introduction. But what Chapo Trap House did, I think, very usefully was do two things. One, allow people to express anger at the system, particularly people under 40 who have been screwed by it. And two, but they basically called out what they consider to be bullshit, which was not allowed in the mainstream press. Those are actually pretty important political functions. That's not a joke to be able to call bullshit on something that's not getting play in the mainstream press. Historically, that's actually very important to ideological and ideational development. And just like the people you were talking about in the 30s and the Trotskyists versus the Stalinists, what they were doing was challenging to some degree a New Deal consensus and a conservative consensus. And what they were effectively doing was calling bullshit. And they, in fact, had a lot more in common, I think, with Chapo Trap House than you might be willing to admit, particularly when they were young, when Daniel Bell was young, when Irving Kristol was young, when Stanley Hook was young, and which I think.
You really think that these guys are going to, like, produce serious intellectual work? Come on.
Not the Chapo guy. I think
Can we be real?
Well, some of the people that.
I mean, first of all, the joke was, like, funny in 2016, 2015, and as I've been a target of their whatever it is. But it's a little bit stale now and sort of a one-note pony. I mean, I know. I just kind of feel like we've had the Chapo moment.
Well, we can get questions about culture, which I think actually, like, the left, having a cultural sphere is actually really important to ideological transformation and change. But I'm not sure if the Chapo guys want to produce serious work, but I think many of their listeners will. I think many of the young people who first got turned on to politics through Chapo Trap House will, quote unquote, make the long march through the institutions, and they will produce both serious intellectual work and serious policy. And I think that is not so wacky to think. So, for example, how did the libertarians become popular?
Because listen to their podcast. I mean, I haven't listened in, admittedly, a long while. But when it came out and it was a hot thing, I did listen to it. I listened to, I guess, when they would make fun of me or whatever. But I also listened to some other stuff. I mean, have you listened to them?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Okay, and you think that the Chapo community will go on to?
Absolutely, of course. I mean,
okay.
Eli, what were you like at 21? I mean, there's a
fair enough. I actually was very much on the left at 21. Right, you can find in the archives of the Trinity College Trinity Tripod a column I wrote called "Why I'm a Socialist." So I was like a big lefty at age 21.
When were you born? If you don't want to talk about 72. Okay, so your political experience. Okay, so you were born before the 73 war. Okay, just trying to place you. Okay, interesting. So should we turn on to speaking of a little bit about foreign policy? Should we turn on to
sure.
So I recently published a review in the New Republic, even the liberal New Republic, about Samantha Power's recent.
Yeah, the New Republic is a very different place than when I was writing for it. Let's be real.
Yeah, much better.
You fit right in, my friend.
It's much more to the. Eli, you were writing under Marty Peretz, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote. I mean, when Frank Foer was the editor and others, right. So I was right.
To give a brief history, would you say it's fair to say
Judas
the left
was there, who was sort of the in-house. I mean, I don't know. I was a contributing editor at one point, but
okay. So regardless, it was much more center right to center left, and now it's probably, you would say, on the left, fairly around where the nation is.
Yeah, it's
it's I
call it Safe Space Weekly.
Okay, we could talk about safe space. Why you might not like them. But let's just move on from now. So I published a piece on Samantha Power's memoir in the New Republic, in which I criticized the idea of humanitarian intervention from a number of philosophical and historical / empirical perspectives. So it might just be a bit too difficult because it's kind of a complex memoir that takes you through Samantha Power's life. So it might just be important to post the link, and then people could read it before moving on if they want to do that to themselves. But why don't you tell me, either you could summarize some points that you think I disagreed with, or what you thought I got wrong, or the whole question really of humanitarian intervention, which was a very hot topic for a while, even though it's kind of fallen off the face of the earth.
Well, I'm not really a Samantha Power fan, so I'm sort of in this weird position of defending her, but I mean, I guess I would put it. I would say what you wrote, the thesis of your review is that the education of Samantha Power is ironic because she didn't learn much. It was like your first, it's a nice little zinger in the first graph, and then you sort of go on to sort of say that I think you're flirting with the idea, and you kind of, I don't know if you come out and sort of say, but instead of looking at, you sort of say, listen, if you pose the question as, should the U.S. intervene to save lives, then, yeah. But if you look at the broader context of things, you argue that, we should look at ways of demilitarizing our foreign policy because oftentimes we cause more harm than good, and the
domestic is important as well. And
that, that we divert resources from social welfare programs. So I guess my question is, do you want to just get rid of the U.S. military at this point?
Most of it, yeah. And particularly the international. And then we could start talking about the liberal international order and the 800 bases.
Yeah, sure. But let's. So what would you like to see? Would you like the U.S. to get rid of its nuclear weapons?
No. I think that would be impossible at this point. I think actually nuclear weapons provide an enormous amount of national security. And I think that if you look at the people who were first talking about them in the 40s and the 50s, their great hope was that they would actually, across the political spectrum, from Henry Harley Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, who really made it an independent thing and helped ensure the Air Forces got control of the bomb, to Henry Wallace. So from the right to the left, we're arguing that what nuclear weapons could do is actually reduce the American military budget and ensure that we don't have a militaristic political culture, which I think we certainly do. So, but yeah, we don't need most of the military. We don't need to be on roughly 800 to 1,000 bases, depending on who you ask, around the world. And other countries should basically be responsible for the majority of their defense. We also face no existential challengers, whether it's Iran or North Korea or back in the day, Iraq. And we should stop pretending like it's that Stalin is in power and he has nuclear weapons for 4 years between 1949 and before he dies in 1953. And that we're actually on path dependency because a lot of the institutions that still maintain American foreign policy were either created during World War II to manage the war or were created during the very beginnings of the Cold War when it was legitimate to fear some sort of Soviet encroachment in Western Europe when Stalin, a genocidal dictator, was in charge of the Soviet Union. We don't live in that world, and we should stop pretending like we do.
Well, the military is reduced from the height of the Cold War. There's fewer ships and fewer. There is some reduction.
Yeah, that's not the point I'm making.
Right.
much far. Yeah, it has.
Would you defund the NSA and the CIA? Would you?
I would create new types of intelligence gathering institutions. I think there's so many. I don't know. It'd have to be a form of democratic and congressional control. I think that would be my most important.
I think I kind of agree with you. I agree with you on the just basic point that I think that there's way too much there's too little oversight of the intelligence community.
There's almost no oversight of the intelligence community.
On this we agree. I mean, I'm an odd duck in that respect, I suppose, because...
Just to quickly say, I think the problem is they were designed that way. And if you look at my scholarly work, it actually focuses on this moment in the 40s and the 50s. And I think all of the institutions of national security were essentially created to insulate them from the democratic public and Congress.
Well, but there's been spasms, of course, as we know, like the church and the pipe and oversight. And one could argue maybe to a lesser extent what Feinstein's committee did a few years back.
But they've relied on norms. They refuse to legislate or really to create mechanisms for action.
I'm just saying that I think there's moments of reform, and I think we're in need of another kind of oversight now, which really put me at odds with many of the other neocons in the Trump era, because I did think that there was a lot of abuse of power, as I've talked about and written a lot about, in the sort of pursuit of Trump, in the way in which you saw, like, I think basically a lot of innuendo reference to secret information that didn't pan out about the Russia stuff. And Trump I'm less worried about because he is the president and a powerful figure, but I think there were lesser figures who were kind of caught up in that. And I would say there certainly was kind of FISA abuse, and it was amazing to me to see how little interest the left had in that. Not the left, but my colleagues in the media, national security space.
Yeah, they're liberals, and I would critique liberals harsher than a lot of conservatives.
But I want to get back to something, because I think that I want to sort of drill down on something. Do you think that if America began basically walking away or scaling back its commitments to its allies and so forth overseas, that the world would be a safer place?
Yes. I think it would allow. Yes. I think, well, for several reasons. One, I don't think the world was a particularly safe place during the era of American leadership. Just to give some numbers, roughly 20 million people died between 1945 and 1989 in Cold War era-related conflicts. Roughly 1,200 people a day.
That's important to figure out from where and by whom.
Almost all in Asia. A lot related to the Vietnam War and its aftermath. Paul Chamberlain talks about this in his Rethinking the Long Peace book. It's really interesting. I think it might be of interest to you. And two, America supported at least 66 covert regime changes, and 44 of those cases supported authoritarian regimes. And I think what scholars...
66. I know the biggies, but what are the 66? Seems like a high number to me.
It's in Lindsay O'Rourke's book, Covert Regime Change. The graph is on page 3. In 44 of those instances...
I'm okay. I'd like to see Lindsay O'Rourke's... I'm just saying I'm aware of, like, Guatemala, Iran,
Chile,
South Vietnam.
Yeah, obviously Vietnam. But so a lot of instances, and in fact, whenever the United States intervened, people in the aftermath were more likely to be victims of political violence and genocide. And Lindsay talks about this in her book, and I think it's really important. So I would say that during the majority of America's world leadership, the world was an incredibly dangerous place. And in fact, that American intervention distorted organic developments with people who have better regional knowledge and better knowledge of not only their own societies, but the region in which they exist, would have been able to take responsibility for their own defense, would have been able to come to basically concords with people in the region or not, whatever the case may be. At least the United States would have been militarizing the conflict. And I think the United States also has to reckon with the fact that it essentially armed the world. And I think that the United States armed the world with its guns, along with the Soviet Union. And I'm not denying the Soviet Union was a horrible dictatorial state that no one should be romantic about. I don't think it was particularly good. I don't think it also, importantly, I don't think it totally delegitimizes the very idea of communism understood as the equal distribution of goods. I think it delegitimizes the idea of central planning and authoritarianism. So I just want to cut you off at that pass. But you might say, but yeah, I think the world would be actually a much safer place, and the 20th century would have been much less violence if the United States never fought a Cold War and if the United States didn't build a global basing structure.
So if the United States didn't fight the Cold War, but the Soviet Union did, the world would be better?
Well, that's quite a counterfactual. I think what the history actually demonstrates is that the Soviet Union was willing to make an agreement in the mid-1950s, and definitely, I know this 100%. If you look at the actual Soviet documents between 1953 and 1956, the Soviet Union was ready to make a deal, particularly at the 1955 Geneva summit. The United States didn't, because they had a very naive understanding of the Soviet Union, and definitely after 1962, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis and the end of the Second Berlin Crisis, the Soviet Union was ready to make a deal. So it's historically historically inaccurate to claim that the United States wouldn't have fought the Cold War and the Soviet Union won. The Soviet Union, from what all the historical documentation shows, and there's actually quite a bit available in Russian, was not ready or willing to fight a Cold War right after Stalin's death and right after 1962, and that's a decade before détente. So that's an incorrect counterfactual. It's not supported by the evidence.
So I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying is that you don't think the commies would try to make like the rest of the world communist, or the U.S. just decided we're going to take a neutral view in Europe, whatever they decide, they decide.
Their own documents say that it's socialism in one country, and they turn to the third world because the United States does. I mean, that's what the historical documentation says. This isn't a guess. It's not.
So you're saying that the Soviets would have left the Cold War, the third world alone, had it not been for the U.S. trying to make the world safe for democracy. That's your view?
Yes, and that is a lot of emerging historical consensus particularly in the 50s and the 60s.
Okay, but I'm not overstating here. I think to say that the driving force of Leninism is basically the idea that there is a global proletarian revolution that they have to support.
That's not accurate. I mean, if you look at the actual history, that you're repeating George Kennan. So what people don't know is in George Kennan's long telegram, February 1946, he argued essentially that the Soviet Union is this inevitably expansionist state because of he actually said more because of the Russian mind, and then Marxism and Leninism is sort of attached to like this Russian impulse to expand, which is, I think, decades of historical scholarship have shown is complete nonsense. And if you're going to argue that, I think the real danger is of American Christian millenarianism, which is built into the founding of the Republic, and that consistently expanded from the 13 colonies west, and then during the Spanish-American, or really the War of 1898, took colonies in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, essentially controlled Cuba, and then during the Cold War built a global basing system of 800 bases that did not and never did compare to the Soviet Union. So if you're worried about the importance of expansion...
Well, it didn't compare to this. Listen, but U.S., where there's countries where there's U.S. bases, the U.S. does not exert the same kind of control the Soviet Union did on its client states. I mean, you would acknowledge that. It's a different kind of thing. Now, you use the term... And a lot of academics will use the term as sort of the imperium or whatever, but it's not really the same thing. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have the same relationship it does with countries where its bases are located than what the Soviet Union had with countries in Eastern Europe. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Two things. Depends where you're talking about. The United States has 5 territories which are denied sovereignty still today. We could go through them: Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, etc.
So you're for Guam liberation?
I'm for Guam becoming part of the American polity, and so our areas of it don't get nuclear tested. Not in Guam, but elsewhere in these territories. I think that would be important. But I would say in Latin America, the United States has asserted effective veto control over a lot of political decisions in the region. And in some instances, yes, it did mirror the Soviet relationship to Eastern Europe. But if you're talking about the North Atlantic world, I would agree with you. Germany, the FRG, West Germany.
Let me put all of my cards on the table. I know this may be controversial, but I just think the American system is morally and in every possible way superior to the communist approach. And I have no problem, and I know you've written a lot on this, calling it evil like Reagan. So that's me. I guess I'm an odd duck, but I just feel that it's not really comparable when you just look at the sort of scale of human misery that was caused by Soviet communism and the Soviet experience. And I think that for the most part, and I'm not one of these guys who, I don't know if there are people on the right, but I don't want to justify the coup against Allende, for example. But I would say that over time, especially at the sort of in the twilight of the Cold War, what we saw was all of those countries in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, which had juntas that the Americans helped support and create in some ways, were able to sort of transition back to a democratic governance, because as opposed to the I think that in the aftermath, if you look at the places that used to be part of the Soviet sphere of influence, it's a very different situation. So
yes, and there's perhaps lots of reasons for that related to political culture. And I'm not apologizing for the Soviet Union. Its control of its sphere of influence is absolutely horrible, and it totally denied liberal rights. And I agree with you that liberal rights are very, very important. But when you make blanket statements like that, are you willing to make the same thing about American capitalism and slavery, or American capitalism and mass incarceration?
Well, slavery is terrible. I'm not just.
I know you're not denying it, but do you see what I'm saying? Like when you make claims that except the Soviet Union was horrible and this is because of its socialist political philosophy, are you saying that mass incarceration then emerges from a capitalist political philosophy?
Well, I think there is a problem with over-incarceration.
No, but
I'm opposed to the drug war. I'm familiar with Michelle Alexander's work, and I think it's a serious issue. I just don't think you can really compare it to the lack of any justice system and the treatment of so-called kulaks and the massive use of the gulags, which then in turn became its own kind of mini slave system within the Soviet Union. I'm not arguing that I'm not arguing in any possible sense that America and the American experience in the 20th century did not have, grotesque flaws in a lot of ways that would be perfected. I am an American exceptionalist in the sense that I do think that we have the DNA in our country through the Constitution to constantly try to perfect and to address our original sin of slavery. But, so that's my view on America. I just think that there's nothing redeemable about the Soviet system. It's a good thing that it's gone. And I do think that there was at least an element of it that was expansionist. And I think that the world would be a worse place if we had adhered to a kind of détente earlier, or we had agreed to as a sphere of influence for the Soviet Union and tried to act for the sake of peace, that there would be always sort of two worlds. I think that it's a good thing that system fell. And yes, the world's more chaotic right now, but, I'm unapologetic in that respect, which is that I'm glad the Soviet Union was defeated.
So, that's a hell of a counterfactual. I think it'd be difficult to claim that the arming of the Third World beginning in the late 1950s, which occurred as a direct result of the Cold War and everything from Vietnam to genocide in Indonesia, the world would have been a better place if the United States decided not to do those things.
Well, I think the world's a better place if the Soviet Union no longer exists.
Sure, I'll agree with that, but I as I said repeatedly, I'm not apologizing for the Soviet Union, but how do you account for the fact that many post-Soviet scholars have demonstrated that ordinary people who were formerly in the Soviet Union have a nostalgia because at least there was less income inequality and less kleptocracy, which one could argue partially emerged as a result of the hyper-capitalization of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and 2000s?
Well,
it's not redeemable.
As anybody can, if you read Russian history, if you go back to the Romanovs, it's a miserable place, Russia. I say that I have Russian heritage. I'm Jewish, but it's where my family fled from, Ukraine.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's like, I hope they get it right. I really do. But it seems like whether it's the czars, the commissars, or, the kleptocrats and the oligarchs, it's just still the same old misery, the same old cruelty. It's just a feature of life in Russia. And it sucks. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. I throw up my hands. I'm certainly to kind of get back to Samantha Power. There was a time, I think, in the 90s and the early 2000s after 9/11 when I was of the view that America and, American might and American leadership could accomplish anything. I think Russia is kind of an unsolvable problem in the sense that I'd love to see there to be I would love for there to be a democratic revolution in Russia. I loathe Putin and what he represents. I'm worried that if he died tomorrow, that what might replace him would be worse. And I'd like to support whoever in the sort of, if there is a democratic movement, I'd like to America and the rest of the world to support it. But yeah, it's there's a no-win situation. But listen, I've seen those arguments that. At least we had, at least I had a job at the factory, that kind of thing, at least. But come on, it was miserable under the Soviet Union people.
Well, I think that's difficult to say, and it paints with far too broad a brush. And if you actually dig down, people, live their lives. But I'm not going to defend in any way horrible systems like the Gulag or the denial of freedom of association. It's obviously terrible. But
as an historian, do you think that this has to do with maybe the Mongol conquest of the Russian princes, which just I think was so horrific that maybe it sort of, I don't know. I mean, I'm asking, you're a historian.
This is like deep history stuff. But I think that's difficult to know, and especially when I'm not a specialist. But I do think there's actually more complexities than a lot of the Cold War era historiography written by people like, what was his name? Richard Pipes, right? He was the big Cold War. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these people are writing their histories from a very Cold War lens. And I think a lot of the new historiography of Russia and particularly the Soviet Union complicates the story you're telling, though it's not my field. But I think it's important. What I wanted to say, I want to say quickly two things. Very briefly, have you ever heard of the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, that concept?
No.
It's by a very famous Jewish historian. I can't believe his name is escaping me, but like Gershom Scholem, like someone incredibly famous. And he argued against the lachrymose conception of Jewish historiography, which became an ideal, particularly in the diaspora, basically narrating Jewish history as a series of pogroms. And I want to just argue a bit against that, because I wouldn't agree with you that Russia was nothing but a horrible place. There was the Haskalah that came out of it, a lot of really innovative Jewish thinking, particularly for people of our ethnic background. And my family also did flee the pogroms in Russia in roughly 1895 to 1905. So not to romanticize it, but I think your take on Russian history a bit oversimplifies. But more important, as a neocon,
well, I would forget the treatment of the Jews. I'm just saying that when were regular people in Russia? You know what I'm saying? I mean, if I'm counting under the Soviet Union, your life could be turned upside down if your neighbor, may have overheard you saying something that you shouldn't have said. Or if you had the misfortune of someone mailing you a Western magazine. My point is that it's just like, I don't know, when's the golden era? Catherine the Great? When's the time in Russian history where things were really pretty good? And I'm like, I can't figure it out. I can go to Islamic history. There were times in Islamic history that were like, hey, things were really moving,
Right, but I mean, you could say the same about American history. When was the golden age? And like, if you get stopped you get stopped and frisked for cocaine, then you're in jail for 30 years. Your life could be turned upside down pretty easily too. And I think you could say the same about the golden age.
Yeah, I just think I would say, yeah, America has its flaws, but like, and in a lot of ways we're living in a golden age. Is that we don't really know it right now, but like things have been pretty good for us after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, you can go through. It's like unprecedented prosperity in a lot of ways too.
Well, you're defining it according to consumption, right? I think the fact that everyone's on antidepressants indicates that maybe something isn't quite right with capitalist society and the alienation of society. But yes, if you're defining happiness through consumption, I would agree. Americans consume a ton of the world. It may destroy the world in the medium term, but at least we're able to have our various devices.
We used to have 3 networks. Now we have like 700,000 or something. Anyway, just.
Well, yeah.
Listen, I don't know. I'm just, come on, let's not even compare. Are we really comparing? Are we really comparing like life in Russia, like Russia? I mean, come on. Really?
Well, it depends where you look. What if you were a black person in the South in 1952? I mean, you can't draw these very broad brushes. That's all I'm saying. You have to actually look at history in all of its complexity if you want to understand the world and have a particularly good strategy. But let me just one quick thing. So you were talking about your post 9/11 and your pre-Iraq war situation. So now what's your take on quote unquote what the U.S. is able to do in the world? Because clearly the shine has come off that a little bit, right? Clearly that the faith in U.S. power that you had earlier on is no longer what it is. So where is it now? What do you think U.S. power can do? And what do you think the proper role of the military should be, or what the size of the U.S. military should be, or what we as a country should be spending our money on? And does it matter that our prosperity comes at the expense of a hierarchical system where the global North essentially exploits and takes advantage of the global South?
Well, there's a lot there in what you've asked, but I guess I would argue that if America was to scale back its alliances and commitments abroad, then I believe it's fair to say that just chaos and bloodshed and other things would ensue. Wow. So I think an important role of the American military is, to be perfectly blunt, just to scare the shit out of every other scumbag. And that's a valuable thing, So, like in my view, it would have been nice after we learned that Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons for some horrible thing to have happened to him and his family. And, for him to as a sort of demonstration that if you are to use chemical weapons, there will be hell to pay. And the fact that he was able to sort of get away with it, and I think you could plausibly say his use of chemical weapons was important to his survival. Certainly I think, and he looked at Gaddafi and sort of said, "Oh my God, I can never let that happen to me." It's tricky. On the other hand, I certainly don't think America should be invading countries and setting up a coalition provisional authority and so forth and so on. I think that that's just a fool's errand in many ways, and we're not built for it. America is not built for it. What I mean by that. Whereas I think that the British had a kind of system where it allowed for them to have, like 250 years of an efficient kind of, managed, a huge global empire. I don't think America really is built for that. And then that's a good thing in a lot of ways, because you and I agree on things like democratic oversight of our intelligence institutions and things like that. I know this is not a satisfying answer, but I think the main place where America can make a difference is that a kind of recognition that there are certain states that are uninterested in being part of, I don't like the term of liberal world order for other reasons, I think, than you, but I do think that there is a sort of sense of like, can we ever expect that China is going to act in the way that we would want a responsible kind of global citizen or global state to act in the community of nations? Can we expect them to not try to steal all this intellectual property? Can we expect them at some point over time? And the great hope was that they would democratize and eventually they would sort of reform, and it hasn't happened. And so what do you do? So I don't think we should go to war with China, but I do think that it's time to begin separating from China in important ways. So I support, for example, the initiative which Trump has wavered on to try to get U.S. tech companies to have different supply chains that don't go through China. I liked what you and Isaac Stonefish had to say largely about using our moral authority in some cases, or trying to get other Western democracies to use their moral authority, maybe trying to pressure the UN to condemn and have a North Korea style kind of UN general, big report on the treatment of Uyghurs and, the other minorities in Western China and Xinjiang. But for the most part, I guess, my view of what America should do to support democracy and freedom is largely a kind of diplomatic one. I do think that there are things that American civil society can do to support other civil society in less free countries. So I'm a big believer in people power movements and democratic revolutions. That, I think, is the most effective way, not military invasions. And again, I would keep the military around. I would keep the alliance structure in place. I have a lot of criticisms of Saudi Arabia. I think it would be worse if Iranian proxies were in control of like the Gulf of Aden and the Saudis at this point, from our interest. Although, given all of we've learned in the last year, and not just about Khashoggi, but in general kind of MBS and how he treats his rivals, it's harder to make that case. Although I think you can still make that case, because I just think Iran is just fundamentally against our interest in every possible way.
Yeah, I don't understand why there's literally no reason to think that, unless you identify Israel's interests with the United States, and you very well might, but I don't, and I don't think most people do. Just a couple of quick comments, and I want to return to that actually. When you compare China's actions in the world and the United States' actions in the world, it's not even close in terms of who's been a more destabilizing force. And I think you would agree with that, given the various invasions the United States has done, and particularly the fact that it has essentially armed the world over the past 70 years, and particularly in the past 30 years. I agree with you about diplomacy, of course. I want to, though, ask two questions. One, what would you reduce the military to? What would you do?
I don't know if I would necessarily reduce the military.
Just saying, the military now the United States is permanently in the world for essentially forever.
Yeah.
Okay, that doesn't seem to be politically possible or realistic, but that's fine. And I
think Americans are largely fine with it. I just don't think they like fighting wars. I don't think they like fighting like endless wars that don't really have a victory point. But I think you say, hey, should America have a lot of bases all around the world? I think they'd be like, yeah, sure.
I'm not sure that is the case.
In
but
the words of the great USA for Africa, we are the world.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, the problem, identifying U.S. interests with the world. But fine, what are the U.S. interests in the Middle East? What if we develop alternative energy? Do we have interest there anymore?
Well, I think America. Listen, I'm in favor of developing alternative energy. I'm a Zionist. I want Israel to exist. It is thriving at this point, and I think it's important because Israel and America are so identified that America, again, stays with its allies, and I think it's important to check the expansion of Iran in every possible way. But I mean, I'm frustrated with the approach of, I feel like the quickest way is to try to get a kind of global movement that's similar to like what ended apartheid to support the Iranian, democratic movement, which is there and reminds us every few years that they are there. And eventually, I think that there is a real legitimacy crisis in Iran, and I think that is. I mean, I would just think the world would be so much better place if there was a new revolution. And I think there's so many Iranians who want that, and I'd like to figure out intelligent ways for the United States to help them. I mean, I'm not in favor of invasion. I say it all the time. I don't think that would accomplish anything. And I'm against the CIA involvement, obviously, given its history, and also because I just don't trust the institution of the CIA to do any of that kind of stuff. But I think that there's certainly a role for the U.S. government, but more importantly, civil society in America and the Western world to make it a priority to try to help the Iranian people overthrow their government.
Yeah, even though that delegitimizes the movement and has repeatedly.
Well, I don't know about that. Listen, I mean, there's some people who say it is. I would do it on the term. I mean, I think it's important to identify kind of an Iranian diaspora leadership and within the country. But I'm not entirely sure of it. I spent a lot of time reporting on this. I think that there's different opinions, and I'd also think that it's important to. I would just give up on any kind of. I wouldn't want to make any deals with the regime. That's the main thing. I guess you could say that my neoconservatism in foreign policy now is largely a defensive action against engagement with rogues.
But why would
no more agreements with Iran? I don't want an agreement with North Korea. I don't want any of that stuff. I want to try to play a longer game where you deter and, work as best you can in the smartest way for democratic revolutions in those kinds of countries. And as for China, I do think that we have to deter them, and I think it's important to try to hem them in as well. I mean, would you just give up on Taiwan?
I wouldn't fight World War III over it. That's for sure.
I don't want. Nobody wants to fight World War III, but I think again, it's like I mean, I want to make like I would. You support the idea of making Taiwan a porcupine, so that it's like really expensive for the Chinese to attack them and invade them?
I just think in 50 years, the United States is not going to be in the Eastern Hemisphere. And so we need to start talking about security transitions. What's going to happen is at some point, China's going to cross a quote unquote red line. And then it's just going to be chaos from there. That's what I actually think. And
or to go the way of the Soviet Union.
Yes, or that could happen. That's always
I'm for that. That's the better outcome.
The United States is not going to be able to control that. And I think also depends how you read the end of the Cold War, but I don't think the United States had an effect in that. It was deficiencies in the system that you could see.
I agree that sometimes there's there's a version of sort of like, it was all because of Reagan's policies. I think Reagan helped it and pushed it along. I do think that there's something to the argument that he tried to outspend them on arms. I think that's a
big argument. I think it's minor, but I want to conclude here with just a topic that I think you might find interesting. So we are different generations. We're both American Jews. You were born in 1972. I was born in 1984. So I was just wondering, what's your take on
that? Make us different generations, I guess.
Yeah, Gen X, an elder millennial. So I was just, what do you think about the fact that a lot of Jews under 40 are much, much more, I don't use the term anti-Israel because I don't think 99.9% of Jews would not say Israel doesn't have a quote unquote right to exist. And I think that's what anti-Israel implies. But I think there's a much more skepticism of the Israeli state, Israeli actions, and particularly Israel trying to define who's a Jew, who isn't a Jew, and obviously the brutal occupation of the Palestinians and the settlement movement. And are you worried about the fact that basically everyone under 40 is much, much, much more skeptical of Israel and its politics, and it doesn't have the consensus it did in the wake of the 73 war and the terrorist bombings of the 90s, et cetera? Do you see that as a problem for Israel?
No. I'm less worried about it. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I think American Jews skew left. It is a really big deal on the left right now to sort of say that there's all these things you don't like about Israel, and that's just the way it is. And there's a lot of people who really like Israel, in America and the rest of the world, for, in some cases, the same reasons why, as you say, Jews under 40 don't like Israel. I also think that as they get older, they will appreciate it more. I think, generally the kind of, I know you don't want to say anti-Israel argument, but whatever you want to call it, this new skepticism, as you say, of Israel or whatever, it's a kind of cartoonish view that is, driven by a kind of activism. My personal view is that, I'm sure you've heard of this thing called birthright. Have you heard of it?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so birthright, they send Jews to Israel, and the idea to try to create a connection. So if I was interested in trying to foster Zionism, I would do birthright, but instead of sending them to Israel, I would send them to live in Ramallah for 3 weeks. Say, I just think that there's a kind of, I've lived in Cairo and I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I just think that there's a real cultural difference between what Western Jews kind of think about the world and then when they kind of encounter it. And I think that you would find a very different perspective.
Of course, but that's not the argument I'm making. The argument is that...
No, I know. The argument you're making is that there's less of a connection. We'll see. I think as they get older, there may be more. We'll see what happens.
Not even less of a connection. What you're winding up doing is aligning with Christian Zionism, Christian Zionists who effectively have an anti-Semitic reason for...
I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that. So why do you think Christians...
I think there's a lot of Christians. I think there's a lot of people who... I think that Israel has become a more political issue. So there's a lot of people who, when they find themselves on the right, they kind of like Israel. And part of the reason they like Israel is because guys like you don't like Israel. That's part of it. And it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of that goes on. So I think that, there's a kind of... And it is a kind of... It's something that I've noticed in a lot of areas, but it's sort of why is Israel constantly being every day it's criticized. There was a line in your piece about the UN Human Rights Council. Why are you okay with the UN Human Rights Council not saying a damn thing about Syria, which was a human rights catastrophe, and then going on for this 85th resolution against Israel? I think it's a joke. If you care about human rights, why would you
If you care about human rights, don't you think that the people who actually rely on the United States are more likely to be affected by U.S. actions in terms of promoting human rights? That's the point I was making.
Yeah, I'm talking about the UN Human Rights Council, though. How am I supposed to take the UN Human Rights Council seriously when
I wasn't about the Human Rights Council. I was talking about how power was crowing that she got the HRC to stop resolutions against Israel, but uses absolutely none of the American power that she had at her disposal to affect the treatment of Palestinians in Israel. That's the argument I was making. It had nothing to do with the human rights.
Listen, first of all, God, I hate to defend Samantha Power and the Obama administration, but they did. At the end, they supported the resolution, which I thought was wrong, but they abstained from that resolution. They condemned the Israeli settlements. They certainly pressured Netanyahu a number of times over their time, to curb settlements. There's a lot of things that were done. I think I disagree with you there that they didn't do anything as a matter of policy on this issue. They spent a lot of time on it.
Not the Obama administration, Samantha Power. But do you think the ultimate goal is ethnic cleansing in Israel?
No.
What do you think the goal is of Netanyahu and Likud?
I think the goal of Netanyahu is to stay in power.
Okay, fine. But
I think that the ultimate view is that the Israelis believe that after in the 2000s they gave back they depopulated the settlements in Gaza and they depopulated 5 settlements in the West Bank, that they were met with less stability and more violence, and they just felt that, all right, well, we don't really have a peace partner at this point. So I think that is why the sort of consensus view. I think this is why I wrote in my recent column, I think that it's really important to encourage Palestinian elections and not just have a boss and then he'll die eventually and then have a bunch of these cronies in, or Hamas, which is just awful too. I think it's important to try to foster that along with all these other sort of governance reforms. And I think that when that happens, I think you would probably see the resurgence of a 2-state peace movement in Israel that would have a real viability in terms of elections. I think the reason that they don't have it now is they look across and they say, well, who are we negotiating with and what's the point? We're not going to
So you think it's not ethnic cleansing because you think that the Israeli public is waiting for a legitimate partner in peace, that once it emerges, it will make a 2-state solution?
It's not ethnic cleansing because the population of Palestinians continues to expand and that there is no effort to try to wipe them out or move them out of the West Bank.
So the goal of settlements is not to expand the settlements? I'm honestly asking. I'm not an expert on this.
Listen, I think that there's two things that are going on. I think that there is a view that there should be some sort of Israeli security positions along the Jordan River, and I think that there's a view that population like sort of centers of Jews, which would probably be part of Israel in any kind of final deal. Those in some cases have expanded, but I also think that that mainly what you're seeing is that there's no momentum in terms of that on the Israeli side, as I said, because they don't really think that there is any kind of partner on the Palestinian side.
No, I know, but so do you think the status quo is just continued expansion in the West Bank?
I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily. I mean, we'll see what happens. As I said, I think that we have to sort of see what happens post Netanyahu, like what becomes of that. We'll find out soon enough in like a week, right? Whether the next government will see another prime minister. But I do think that if you look at the sort of figures in the Israeli center at this point, they have a resentment as well of some of the extremists on the settler side, and that there'll be an effort to try to consolidate Israel and wait for the partners. Now you can argue that this is.
So you think they'll consolidate? You think they'll stop settlements, consolidate their position, and then use those settlements as a bargaining chip when they quote unquote have a partner for peace?
Well, I think they certainly use those settlements as a bargaining chip, and I don't think that there's certain things that the Israelis will not give up.
Right. Do you think? But
I don't think that Israel will give up any kind. I don't think that you're going to see like a redivision of Jerusalem. That's like off the table. But I thought that was off. That would have been off the table for Rabin. So it depends on what you mean by settlements. Like, I do think that you're able to get to a viable Palestinian state at some point, and that I do think that you could do that. I hope that.
You believe in the two-state solution.
What?
You still believe that the two-state solution is a possibility, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
I mean, I do.
I think. Yeah. I think that was probably the disagreements with a lot of.
You don't. You think.
I'm not an expert. It just doesn't seem to me that that's particularly viable at this point. And unless the United States steps in and really does something, which I also don't see as something that's particularly viable, Israel will continue to expand settlements in the West Bank and try to push out Palestinians through just continued expansion. I don't see. There seems to be no evidence to me that Israel wants to stop expanding.
I mean, there is a presumption here, by the way, that a future Palestinian state will have no Jews in it. Israel does have Jews in it. Israel does have Palestinians in it, like in Arabs.
Yes.
But the argument that's sort of underlying it is that like a future Palestinian state should have no Jews in it.
I don't know enough about the issue, but my sense of Israeli nationalism is that it's particularly ethno-nationalist, and things like birthright do give the idea that
it's ethno-nationalist.
My birthright to go to Israel, which is to live as a citizen in Israel, which to me is bizarre.
Why is that bizarre? There's lots of countries that have that similar thing. Like if you're like an Irish person born overseas and you can go back and live as an Irish, what's wrong with that?
I mean, a lot of those are
also, but as we know, that part of the reason Israel exists as a safe haven for Jews because the anti-Semites, the pogrom is just around the corner, which I think you should never count that out. So it's like I'm glad that Israel exists as a safe haven.
That's a fundamental difference in our worldview. I don't think the pogrom is just around the corner. I think that it's a misreading of where we are now, even though it might have been. And I understand
Jewish history is on my side on this one, but we'll see.
Well, don't know if that's the case.
Okay, but I see your point, but I'm just arguing like never count it out. You never know.
Well, I think this is where like you and me and Barry Weiss are divided. I mean, I think Barry Weiss's new book, at least the review I read, I haven't read the book, thinks the next pogrom is around the corner. And I think that has to do with a particular type of Jewish education that people received in the 80s.
I have yet to. I'm looking forward to reading Barry's book.
Just for example, I went on,
I don't really want to get into because I haven't read the book yet.
USYS?
What?
USY, United Synagogue Youth, the Conservative Movement's youth movement. Have you heard of it?
I have heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, for example, I went on a USY trip that took us to Auschwitz and then to Israel. And I think that sort of education does impose a particular type of worldview on someone that might not particularly accurately reflect the realities of 2019, where Israel's a nuclear-armed state. And for all the anti-Semitism that is in the United States, the Jews, for a variety of reasons, are not in the existential danger that they were in Europe for a lot of Jewish history, which I admit was the case. But I think it warps one's worldview and puts a particular type of glasses on them that makes him not read 2019.
The Arabs are not so great on the anti-Semitism question either.
Well, we could get into the history
of fact. I mean, it's just like there's a lot of it. If you go, if you look around, I mean, I lived in Egypt. It's not pretty.
Then that gets is the reason because of deep-seated anti-Semitism in Arab culture, or due to various particularities and contingencies of post-colonial and colonial history. But we cannot get into that now. But I would just say I do not think there is, if anything, Christendom is much more, what has been historically much more, has been historically much worse.
You seem like a reasonable guy. You're a good writer. I don't understand, why do you have to, caveat with, okay, yeah, it's not great, but if anything, the American Imperium is just the worst. Because why can't we just have a full stop? Soviet totalitarianism stinks. Because I don't like this Arab or anti-Semitism, whatever. But I mean, it always has to be. I'm just noticing it in our conversation. And I'm saying it not as trying to be difficult, but it just seems like you always are having to say, "But hey, this Christendom worse, Manifest Destiny worse." I don't know.
No, this is why. Because I think we're all, due to the cultures that we grow up in, we're all put on one side. But if you actually take a dispassionate and empirical look at the complexities of history, there's a lot of tragedy and trauma and disgust to go around. So painting with broad brushes I think, does a disservice to history, and it makes people use language like good and evil, which I think has resulted in an enormous amount of damage throughout human history. I don't think there's a good and evil in the world, unless you're fine. Hitler, evil. Stalin, evil. Slavery, evil. Holocaust, evil. We do have to make choices like that. Yes, but I think when you're actually talking about the scrum of international politics, that language distorts and obscures far more than it illuminates, and that most of the time it's not Hitler and it's not Stalin. That's what I would say.
Women fared very well under Baathism. That's what you're saying?
In terms of secularism and things like that. Well, I would say that it's complex. That's what I would say. This is not to defend Saddam Hussein or
No, I know. I'm giving you a hard time.
No, of course. But I think it's just it's more complex. And I think if our foreign policy discussion needs anything, it's empathy and a recognition of the actual complexities of history. That's what I think.
Well, this was a good conversation. I think our foreign policy, I don't know. We really disagree, but it was nice to talk with you.
Yeah.
I'm glad we had this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye. Thanks.